Writing in the Sciences and Social Sciences. Science Project Logbook or Journal. A science project, journal, or logbook provides a written record of a scientific experiment or project, compiled at specific, regular times over the life of the project. It provides a step-by-step record of your methodology, procedures, and findings so that other researchers can verify your findings. Keeping a laboratory notebook is a crucial skill for a scientist to learn. In professional research settings, a laboratory notebook is considered a legal document. Your instructor may have special requirements for your journal or logbook. Be sure you understand what's expected of you. Introduction. The purpose of a science journal or logbook is to provide a record of the entire process of your experiment or project. Keeping a journal faithfully can provide you with details you'll need if you write up a final report about the project. The process of keeping the journal also helps keep you organized over the life of the project. Ultimately, recording every stage of the experiment or project provides other scientists or investigators the information they need in order to replicate what you have done. Your reader, of course, will be your instructor. However, you should keep the journal or logbook as if you were a scientist recording your work for the benefit of other scientists. If you keep in mind that they will need your records in order to reproduce the procedure, your work will be more thorough and professional. Generating content for your journal is not so much a question of brainstorming as of keeping scrupulously accurate records. It is important to get into a routine of recording your data on a regular basis. Logbooks are organized chronologically, following the course of the project or experiment. Unlike with most other forms of writing, you should not plan on writing multiple drafts of your journal or logbook. The point of the document is that it is recorded in real time and not altered. You may revise your entries for spelling and clarity, but be careful not to change too much or the validity of your work may be challenged. Do create a notebook dedicated only to your project. The best choice is a journal with sewn pages so that pages cannot be removed. Your credibility is enhanced if it is clear that your notebook has not been tampered with. Number each page in the top right-hand corner. Do use permanent ink, not pencil or erasable ink, to record your entries. If you need to cross something out, do so with a single line through the deleted text. Don't black out anything or use correcting fluid. It may appear you are trying to hide something. Your records should be permanent and transparent. Do begin the logbook with a short description of the experiment or project, including its objective. Do record your first entry on the first day of your project. Don't wait until the work is underway to start your journal. Do write legibly. The point of keeping a journal is so that others can read and understand what you did. Do record every step of your process. If you are unsure about the level of detail you should use, ask your instructor. Do write each entry immediately after each activity or observation. Don't count on remembering the details later. Record your activities and observations while they're fresh in your mind. Do keep your journal faithfully. If you write irregularly or infrequently, you will certainly miss important information. Do record all the calculations you used to process the data. Doing so will help you find and correct any mathematical errors that may occur. Do note each measurement to the maximum decimal points of the equipment used. Do write your entries clearly, in the active voice, in the first person. You should omit the pronoun I. It's understood that you are doing the work. Many of your entries will be sentence fragments. For example, measured each seedling using metric ruler. Do date and sign each entry. Do title and date all graphs, charts, and figures. Do staple, tape, or glue any computer printouts or photographs into your logbook in the appropriate place. Do write a brief reflection on the results at the end of the experiment or project. Did you obtain the expected results? Did problems occur that might have affected the results? Don't skimp on details. It's better to err on the side of recording too much information than recording too little. Don't remove any entry from your journal, even if it later seems irrelevant or seems to reveal an error on your part. It is more important to keep an accurate record than to perform every step perfectly. Don't feel you need to use formal language in your journal. Write your entries in informal conversational language. Don't round your measurements. Record each measurement to the maximum number of decimal points of the instruments you're using. Logbook entry examples. Friday, March 9th, 2013. Temp, 16 degrees Celsius. Humidity, 70%. Hand-mixed compost. No changes perceivable. Monday, March 19th, 2013. Temp, 19 degrees Celsius. Humidity, 72%. Decomposition has begun. Some food scraps still identifiable. Friday, March 30th, 2013. Temp, 20 degrees Celsius. Humidity, 61%. Decomposition continuing. No mixing. Added 125 grams food scraps. Friday, October 21st, 2011. Plant A given a 6.0% saline solution. Leaves have begun to turn yellow. Monday, October 24th, 2011. Plant A drops a flower. Plant B given a 3.0% chlorine solution. Leaves have begun to turn yellow. Tuesday, October 25th, 2011. Plant C, given only water, appears limp. Making corrections in entries. Mixture turned red after addition of 5 drops, red line through 5 drops, 4 drops of catalyst. Weighed 0.76, red line through 0.76, 0.77 grams calcium citrate. Target was 0.80 grams. Weighed 0.33 grams of iron nitrate and added to a beaker of 7 milliliters ethanol with stirring. There is a red arrow between the word nitrate and pointing upward, and the word chloride written above and between the two words in red. Affixed the pipettes to the frame apparatus. There is a red arrow between the words pipettes and to, pointing upward, and the words and flanges written above in red. Forgot to use sealant. Repeated the procedure using sealant. On March 9th, 2013, reported that sample size of 33, but sample size was actually 31. 2 units broke before beginning of experiment. On September 10th, noted that all specimens were male. In fact, 11 specimens are male and 2 are female. Lab report. A lab report is a common assignment in science and engineering classes. Each discipline has its own preferred format and style for a lab report. A lab report in biology differs from a lab report in chemistry, which in turn differs from a physics lab report. In addition, instructors may have personal preferences about how you write your lab report. What follows here is general guidance that applies to all lab reports. Be sure you understand exactly what your instructor expects from your own lab report. Introduction. The purpose of a lab report is to document the findings of an experiment or procedure and to communicate the significance of those findings. Your report should also demonstrate that you understand the principles the experiment was built upon. Your reader, of course, will be your instructor. However, to get the most out of the assignment, you should write your lab report as though you were truly a research scientist documenting an experiment for an audience of scientists. To be scientifically valid, your results must be reproducible. Therefore, you must document your experiment thoroughly such that another researcher could do what you did and obtain the same results. The process for gathering information for your lab report is not so much brainstorming as keeping accurate notes about your experience as you go along. The model outline to follow gives an overview of an organizational structure for your lab report, but as noted above, different disciplines have different requirements for lab reports, and you should check with your instructor to be sure you understand exactly what is expected of you. Draft your lab report as you would any other formal piece of writing, using grammatically correct English. Refer to your notes often to ensure your report is complete. It's a good idea to take a break after you finish the first draft of your report so you can read the draft with a fresh eye later. Put yourself in your reader's shoes as you read over the draft. Is the report complete? Is it clear? Is there anything missing? Revise your draft as necessary to ensure completeness, clarity, and correctness. Model outline. The format and content of lab reports can differ significantly from one discipline to another and one instructor to another. This model outline contains the components typical of most lab reports. Check with your instructor to be sure you understand what is required of you. Title page. Your title page should include the name of the experiment, your name, and the names of your lab partners, and the date. Abstract. The abstract provides a summary of the purpose of the experiment, its key results, the significance, and your conclusions. The abstract may also mention the methodology you used or the theory that guided the experiment. The abstract is typically one paragraph long with a maximum of 200 words. Introduction. In one or two sentences, the introduction of your lab report states the purpose of the experiment. It also describes the background and underlying theory that the reader needs to understand the experiment. The introduction may also mention specialized equipment used in the experiment and explain the importance of the experiment. Methods and materials. Some lab reports substitute equipment for materials. Some split this section into two separate sections. Provide a brief description of what materials you used and how you used them. Offer enough detail in this section that another researcher could easily reproduce what you did. When you follow procedures laid out in a lab manual or other resource, it is enough to say so and cite that source. Some disciplines require that you note where and when your work was done. Procedure. Some disciplines require a section that documents your procedures step by step in chronological order. Record your steps such that another researcher could duplicate your procedure. Results. The results section should present the findings from the experiment without analyzing their implications. Equations, tables, and figures, and sometimes photographs, are frequently used to present the data yielded by the experiment. All of your tables and figures should be self-explanatory. Discussion. In this section, you analyze and interpret the results of your experiment. Was your original hypothesis upheld or not? You may relate your results to existing knowledge and theory. If your results are different from what you expected, discuss the possible reasons. Discuss any experimental errors. Discuss the strengths and limitations of the research design. You may also suggest directions for future research. Conclusion. Some disciplines require a conclusion to the lab report, which simply states what you know now as a result of this lab experiment. Suggestions for future research may also be placed in this section, depending on the discipline. References or literature cited. List all the sources cited in your report, including your lab manual if you have cited it. Ensure you use the appropriate citation format for this section. Ask your instructor for help if you are unsure about what citation format you should use. Appendices. If necessary, you may attach appendices to your lab report. These might include raw data or tables and figures that do not appear in the report itself. Be sure that you mention each of your appendices at least once in the body of the report. Give each of your appendices an appropriate, descriptive title. Do give your report a descriptive and informative title. For example, instead of Lab Report Number 2, use a title like Lab Report Number 2, Transpiration, or Lab Report Number 2, Melting Point Determination. Do write your report in grammatically correct English. Don't be tempted to use shorthand or sentence fragments. Do use the appropriate verb tense. Because the experiment is completed, you should use the past tense when discussing the experiment. When you refer to the report itself, the theory or the equipment used, write in the present tense. For example, the findings of the report suggest that, and the centrifuge is designed to test. Do describe the steps you took in the order you actually took them rather than copying from your lab manual. If your instructor tells you that you can simply state you followed the procedure in the manual, be sure you note any occasions when you deviated from that procedure. Do write numbers as numerals when they are 10 or greater, or when they are associated with measurements. Spell out all numbers that begin sentences. Do be careful that your pronouns have clear antecedents. Do number all your equations and define every symbol used in the equations. Don't simply rehash the information in the lab manual as background to your lab report. Demonstrate your own understanding of the issues underlying your experiment. Don't write the method section as a how-to. Describe what you did, not what is supposed to be done. Don't use inexact language like relatively close, very similar, or much higher. Instead, report your exact findings. Project proposal format. Research projects in the sciences and social sciences, including theses, often begin with a project proposal. This section provides a general overview of proposal format. Different disciplines use slightly different formats and terminology, and project supervisors may also have requirements that differ. Ask your instructor, advisor, or mentor if you have questions about what's expected of you. Student name. Name of faculty mentor or advisor. Introduction/thesis statement. Provide a basic introduction to the project you are proposing. Describe the topic and/or your thesis statement. Explain why you consider the research important. You may also explain how this project relates to your major field or your future career. Background information/problem definition. Provide an overview of the history of the subject you intend to study. Does your project address a known problem in the field? If so, articulate the problem clearly and describe its background. Research modalities or methodologies. Detail how you plan to carry out the research. Will you rely on publications, interviews, surveys, experiments, or other methods of gathering information? Explain how you will use each. Required resources. Do you require any special resources to carry out your research? Data, special software, and so on? Describe the needed resources here. Goals and objectives/outputs desired. Explain why you are doing the project and what you hope to learn or accomplish through your research. Outline your specific goals and objectives. This section is typically the longest part of the proposal. Final presentation. Describe how you will present the findings of your research. Will you write a paper? Will you give a presentation? To whom? And what will the presentation include? Will you offer recommendations for future research? Literature review. A literature review may be a standalone assignment, part of a research paper in the sciences or social sciences, or a separate section or chapter in a senior thesis paper. It may take the form of an annotated bibliography. A literature review consists of a listing and critical discussion of previous work published on the topic you're writing about, including books, journal articles, and previous literature reviews. It may also include unpublished research as long as you have permission from the author to mention it. The format of a literature review may differ across disciplines, so be sure to ask your instructor what is expected of you. Introduction. The purpose of a literature review is to provide a critical analysis of published work relevant to the field in which you are conducting research. Your review should classify the relevant research studies, describe the evolution of knowledge in that field, compare the works you're reviewing, and situate your own work within the context of the existing literature. Your reader, obviously, will be your instructor. However, to get the most from the assignment, you should write as though you are a professional researcher writing to an audience of your peers. Brainstorming your literature review consists of doing thorough research, understanding the different perspectives and approaches of the sources you are reviewing, and placing your own work within the appropriate context or contexts. You should pay particular attention to identifying and classifying trends in the sources you are reviewing. Depending on your field of study, you may group your sources according to theoretical approach, methodology, subject studied, sample data, or other characteristics. You may find it useful to create lists or even flowcharts to map out the relationship among ideas and research streams. Be willing to go back and revise your classifications if you come across additional information later in the writing process. You can use the upcoming model outline to help you organize your literature review. Write your draft using an objective, scholarly tone. You are free to express your opinions about the work, indeed you should do so, but remember that you are a professional writing to other professionals. It's a good idea to take a break before you finalize your draft. Then come back, reread your first draft, and revise for completeness and accuracy. Model outline. A literature review may range in length from several paragraphs to several pages. The length will be dictated by the number of different streams of literature reviewed, the number of studies within them, and their relationship to your own project. Your review should be as long as it needs to be comprehensive. Introduction. Introduce your topic or area of study, then provide a high-level overview of the previous studies in the same area, or those that will influence your own work. Identify trends in previous research, and briefly situate your work in that context. Present the criteria you will use to review the existing literature and explain the scope of your review. Which studies will you review, which will you omit, and why? Body. Group the various studies you are reviewing into categories according to chronology, research questions explored, methodological approaches, objectives, findings and conclusions, and so on. Consider that some studies may fit in more than one category. It is acceptable to mention a study twice if it does belong in more than one place in your review. Allocate more space to those studies you consider more significant. Make sure the similarities and differences between studies are clear. Conclusion. Summarize the major contributions of the studies you have reviewed, keeping in mind the criteria you laid out in the introduction. Offer an overall assessment of the current state of knowledge and research in the field and point out any major gaps, theoretical, methodological shortcomings, and inconsistencies. Identify directions for future research. Do be precise about which field or fields you are reviewing. Do ensure your categories and subcategories are logical and make sense. Do group like with like. Part of the purpose of a literature review is to trace the development of streams of literature. Ensure that you discuss studies along with those that are similar and trace the lines of influence among them. Do be sure to characterize each work and its contribution to the field fairly and completely. Do make your literature review as comprehensive as possible. Be sure you find all the relevant studies within the streams you're reviewing. Do use strong topic sentences and transitional devices to help the reader follow your argument. For guidance, refer back to the section Writing Strong Paragraphs. Your literature review should read well as a piece of prose. Don't rely on others' literature reviews to construct yours. It's appropriate for you to consider other reviews of the literature, but it's not a substitute for reading and evaluating the literature yourself. Don't review a source you haven't read. Don't just supply a list of references without providing analysis about them. Your literature review should not just be descriptive, it should be analytical. Don't include sources that are not related to the topic you're writing about. In some fields, there is a tremendous amount of published research. Focus only on those sources that have a bearing on your own work. If there is very little previous work in your area, say so in your review. Don't be dismissive or insulting about another piece of work, even if you disagree with its conclusions or feel it was badly executed. State your criticisms, but maintain a professional approach throughout your literature review. Don't omit research from your literature review just because it takes up a position contrary to yours. History essay. Writing about history involves more than just stating facts and regurgitating dates. A key part of the study of history is the ability to assemble facts, draw provisional conclusions from them, and support those conclusions. Writing a history essay gives you the opportunity to practice those skills as you explore a question that interests you. Introduction. The purpose of a history essay is to explore a question about history and propose an answer to that question. Your reader, of course, will be your instructor, but you'll have more fun and produce a better essay if you imagine yourself to be a professional historian writing for an audience of other historians, people who are interested in your topic and expect a high level of professionalism in your work. Your essay thus becomes part of an ongoing discussion that attempts to understand the part of history you're exploring. Brainstorming your paper begins with selecting a good historical question. See the section to come, Asking Historical Questions. Your choice of topic will naturally be limited by the scope of the class, but you should make an effort to find a question that genuinely interests you. You'll be spending a lot of time exploring this topic, so make sure it's one you really want to study. A history paper is generally an argumentative essay, that is, you're trying to prove a point, and as such, is organized around a thesis statement. For additional help, refer back to Argumentative Essay and the section How to Write a Thesis Statement. Your thesis statement will likely be the result of repeated rounds of brainstorming and research. Be sure you allow yourself plenty of time to do research and develop your paper. You may find that you have asked an interesting question but cannot find enough evidence to support your ideas. You will need to be flexible until you hit on just the right topic and thesis. It's very helpful to use an outline as you write your draft. Historical topics can lead in many different directions, and it's easy to go astray unless you have an outline to guide you. Allow yourself enough time so that you can take a break between your first draft and your final revision. As you review your draft, ask yourself if your thesis is clear and if the content of the paper really supports it. Consider rephrasing your thesis if necessary. Is anything unclear? Are your facts and citations correct? Have you included anything irrelevant? Proofread carefully before you submit your essay. Do allow yourself plenty of time to write your history essay. This is not the sort of assignment you can expect to do the night before it's due, or even a few days before it's due. You will need time to conduct research and do some serious thinking. Do develop a plausible and specific thesis statement for your essay. Your thesis should be narrow enough that you can cover it thoroughly in your paper. For help in creating and refining thesis statements, refer back to the section how to write a thesis statement. Do make sure you are arguing a specific point of view in your paper. It is not enough simply to assemble facts and recount events. Your thesis must express a point of view. Do connect your essay to research done by other historians. Unless you are working exclusively with primary sources, be sure to look carefully for work done on the topic by historical scholars and situate your paper in the context of their research. Do make your position in the debate clear. If you are writing about a topic on which others have taken opposing viewpoints, be sure to make it clear where you stand. Don't be shy about declaring your position. Do think critically about your sources. Whether you are using primary or secondary sources, or both, refer to the section Primary and Secondary Sources in Historical Research to follow. You should be careful to confirm the validity of those sources and to compare them against other relevant source materials. Also consider the biases of your sources. Do they express a point of view? How does that point of view influence their usefulness as sources for your paper? Do take time to read the footnotes and endnotes in your sources carefully. It's tempting to skip footnotes, but they often contain a great deal of information that can help you in your research. Do respect the culture and time period you were writing about. Values and norms changed over time, and hindsight gives us the benefit of information that was not available in the past. Even if you disagree with the values of the people you are writing about, try to understand them on their own terms and avoid imposing your own values on them. Do be aware of your biases. Opinions and mores change over time and are shaped by individuals' background and culture. Try to be aware of any biases or assumptions that might influence your perspective and the argument you're making in your paper. Do maintain your argument throughout the paper. It's easy to slip into simply describing events in a history paper. If you choose to narrate the course of historical events, be sure there's a good reason to do so. All the details in your paper should support your thesis. Do write in the past tense. If you're used to writing papers in English classes, you've been taught to recount literary action in the present tense. However, the past tense is appropriate for writing about history. Do document your sources carefully and appropriately. Take notes carefully while you do your research, and note where you read facts and ideas. Use endnotes or footnotes in your paper to cite your sources. The preferred guide for citations in history papers is generally the Chicago Manual of Style, but you should confirm your instructor's preference about citations. Refer back to the section Common Citation Style Guides for Papers. Don't slip into simply recounting events without connecting them to your argument. Don't include irrelevant details, no matter how interesting they are. Everything in your paper should be related to your thesis. If it's not, cut it out. Don't ignore evidence that runs counter to your position. Your paper will be stronger if you can refute opposing evidence. If you cannot, you must at least acknowledge it. Don't twist evidence to make it fit your essay better. It can be frustrating to find material that says almost, but not quite, what you'd like it to say, but you must represent the content of all your research fairly and accurately. Don't use the subjective I in your essay. It's understood that the position you're arguing for is the one you believe. Don't claim other people's original ideas as your own. Keep detailed notes as you do research, and cite your sources carefully. Refer back to the section Plagiarism and How to Avoid It for help in understanding what you need to cite. If you are still unsure about what to cite, ask your instructor for help. Don't rely on emotional arguments to support your position. You may have strong feelings about what you're writing about, but your paper will be stronger if you argue dispassionately and present facts than if you make an emotional appeal. Emotion-driven arguments are easy to dismiss. Asking Historical Questions by the American Historical Association. Narrow the topics. Topics are almost always too broad at their birth. Refining a research topic is necessary because the world of sources is wide and you have only so much time for any one project. Here are 3 quick ways to narrow. Limit the scope. Focus your topic geographically, by time period, or by groups of people. Restrict the topic by looking at only one country or region, one short span of time, one organization, or even 1 or 2 individuals. Choose an angle. Include a theoretical perspective to frame or guide your work. Emphasize one aspect of identity such as class, gender, race, or ethnicity, or a social process like secularization, nationalism, or capitalism. Consider approaching the problem from a particular kind of history: intellectual, environmental, cultural, social, labor, military, or political. Pick among possible sources. Restrict yourself from the start to a range of sources: a couple of books by 2 authors, readings in an anthology, a set of newspapers, while taking care to distinguish between primary and secondary sources. Compose a research question. Restating a refined topic as a question can be harder than it seems, so spend some time on this. Types of historical questions. Some questions cannot be answered by historical research, so it may help to note that historical questions tend to focus on 3 types of problems: the comparison of similarities and differences between 2 moments in the past is a problem of continuity or change over time. An assessment of the array of significant factors and circumstances that influenced individuals and events in the past is a problem of context. The understanding of the ideas, states of mind, and experiences of people in the past is a problem of meaning. Writing the question. Research begins with the question, so write yours out as a single sentence ending with a question mark. Be prepared to rewrite the question as your research progresses. Working thesis statements. The point of research is to investigate difficult questions without obvious answers, but it is never too early to posit possible answers or theses. A thesis is an argumentative answer to a question. Try writing out 1 or more working theses that can be modified as your research progresses. The American Historical Association, AHA, is a non-profit membership organization founded in 1884 and incorporated by Congress in 1889 for the promotion of historical studies. Its website is www.historians.org. Like this. Widows in early modern England and Spain. During the early modern period, England and Spain were the 2 most powerful nations in Europe. How were women treated in these countries? One interesting way to explore this question is to delve into the treatment of widows in these cultures. Widows are an important case because they represent contemporary women at their most free, no longer under the control of either father or husband. Although some historians have pointed to the Reformation as a key point in the development of women's rights in Europe, other evidence suggests that Spanish widows may have had greater legal protections and social acceptance than their English counterparts. In Spain, a highly unified, state-sponsored orthodoxy, the Catholic Church, laid down strict guidelines for the behavior of widows. They were to spend their lives in quiet contemplation, and they were not to remarry. In Catholic countries, widows might enter convents, either as nuns or, more commonly, as residents. Footnote 1. For a discussion of the convent as a place of refuge for widows in late medieval Milan, see P. René Berstein, quote, In Widow's Habit, Women Between Convent and Family in 16th Century Milan, end quote, 16th Century Journal 25, No. 4, 1994, 787-807. The teachings of the Christian Church were frequently disseminated through popular, quote, behavior manuals, end quote, According to P. René Berstein, quote, "The special role of the widow as a model of piety has been developed in Christian thought from early Christian times. Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine all wrote on the subject. The genre exploded, however, in the late Middle Ages, with behavior manuals on the three, quote, states of life, end quote, of laywomen." End quote. Footnote 2. Ibidem, 789. The most prominent theorist on women's conduct at this time was the Spaniard Juan Luis Vives, the author of De Institutione Feminae Christianae. Footnote 3. Juan Luis Vives, a very fruitful and pleasant book called The Instruction of a Christian Woman, 1523. Translated, Richard Hurt, London, 1529, ? A facsimile reproduction of an early printing is available in Diane Bornstein, editor, Distaves and Dames, Renaissance Treatises for and About Women. Delmar, New York. Scholars, Facsimiles and Reprints, 1978. The third section of De Institutione is devoted to the conduct of widows. While Vives does not condemn remarriage in every case, his strong preference is that a second marriage not be necessary. He quotes Paul's advice that it is better to contain oneself than to remarry. Footnote 4. Quote, "Therefore I say unto the unmarried and unto the widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I do. But if they cannot abstain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." End quote. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 8 through 9. The Geneva Bible, the Annotated New Testament, 1602 edition. Editor, Gerald T. Shepard. Cleveland, Pilgrim Press, 1989. In addition to remaining single, widows were to stay at home as much as possible, except to go to church, to avoid contact with male servants, dress modestly, devote themselves to their children, and pray day and night. However, despite the teachings of the Church and domestic theorists like Vives, Spanish widows at this time had significant legal rights. According to David Vosberg, the early fueros law codes assumed that widows were, quote, poor and in need of protection and support. In a legal sense, widows were, quote, much better off than married women. Footnote 5. David Vosberg, quote, "The status of widows in 16th century rural Castile," end quote, "in poor women and children in the European past." Editor, John Henderson and Richard Wall. London, Routledge, 1994. 185. The law protected the property rights of widows. Widows were allowed, for example, to continue to hold an encomienda, a land grant conferred by the Crown, awarded to their husbands even after their husband's death. Footnote 6. Melvina McKendrick, Women and Society in the Spanish Drama of the Golden Age, a study of the mujer varonil. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1974. 42. As Melvina McKendrick writes, quote, "When her husband died, a woman became the legal head of her family, controlling its affairs and arranging the marriages of her sons and daughters." End quote. In fact, widows were the only women in Spain who could legally act as family heads. Mary Elizabeth Perry's study of early modern Seville has found that in spite of various attempts to restrict their behavior, widows were active members of the city's economic and social life. Quote, "Widows protected property, were legal guardians of minor children, provided dowries, signed rental agreements, bought and sold property, wrote their own wills." End quote. Footnote 7. Ibidem, 17. Vosberg, quote, "Status of widows," end quote. 180. Mary Elizabeth Perry, Gender and Disorder in Early Modern Seville, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1990. 15. Despite the strict teachings of the Church and its agents, according to David Vosburg, quote, a widow in Spanish society was accorded considerable respect, end quote. Footnote 8. Vosburg, quote, Status of Widows, end quote, 182. In England, the Reformation made the widow's situation far more complicated. At this time, England was in the middle of a very rough religious and social journey whose destination was unknown. Quote, what had been for centuries a Catholic country was now moving irrevocably toward Protestantism, and no one had any definite idea of just what social relationships, especially for women, might be like in this, quote, new society. Attitudes toward women were changing in some quarters, but society as a whole could not accommodate itself to the change. End quote. Footnote 9. Theodora A. Jankowski, Women in Power in the Early Modern Drama. Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 1992. 37. The advent of Protestantism, in spite of its rhetoric of sexual equality, entailed real losses for many English women. Quote, Henry VIII's destruction of the monasteries and convents, coupled with the growing Protestant focus on marriage as the only acceptable social condition, impacted heavily upon women. That women had no other occupation but to marry doomed those women who could not, or would not marry, to a life on the virtual fringes of society. End quote. Footnote 10. Ebedom. Curiously, in arguing a widow's right to make her own choice of second husband, the Puritans actually constricted the choices she could make comfortably within the orthodoxy of these teachings. Even married women found their roles transformed in ways they may not have appreciated. The Protestant insistence on the husband as the head of the family relegated the women to the status of, quote, helpmeet, in an arena where she had historically held authority. Quote, married, she had lost many of the functions which would have been hers in a Catholic household. Unmarried, she had lost the chance to become a nun. End quote. Footnote 11. Patrick Collinson, Birth Pangs of Protestant England, Basingstoke, UK. Macmillan, 1988. 74. English widows lost not only the option of cloistering themselves in convents, they also lost the popular model of the secluded and single widow. Quote, unlike their Catholic counterparts, Protestant women had no religious justification for a lifestyle that excluded men, and therefore they experienced widespread economic and social discrimination. End quote. Increasingly, the popular imagination lost the ability to accommodate the widow as a legitimate person. Once widowed, she became either a woman, quote, to be married, end quote, or an anomalous and unnatural figure making her way alone in the world. Quote, widowhood transferred women to a status that made it difficult for them to mingle in society. End quote. Footnote 12. Jankowski, Women in Power, 37. Retha M. Warnicki, quote, Eulogies for Women, Public Testimony of Their Godly Example and Leadership, end quote, in Attending to Women in Early Modern England, edited Betty S. Travitsky and Adele F. Seif, Cranbury, New Jersey, Associated University Presses, 1994. 174. Spanish and English cultures had very different ways of conceiving of the widow, not only in religious and quasi-religious writings, but also in popular stereotypes. Spanish widows were popularly characterized as poor, whereas their English counterparts, regardless of their actual economic status, were routinely assumed to be rich. David Vosburg declares that, quote, the phrase poor widow was employed so frequently in Spanish documents of the time that it almost seems to be a single word, end quote. Vosburg's observation makes an interesting contrast to a different linguistic phenomenon in English. The notion of the rich widow became such a commonplace in England that rhetorician George Putnam used it in an example. Quote, "When you will place your adjective after your substantive thus, maid fair, widow rich, priest holy, and such like." End quote. Footnote 13. Vosburg, quote, "Status of widows," end quote. 185. George Putnam, The Art of English Poesy, 1589. Menston, UK, Scholar Press, 1968. 212. Of course, both stereotypes were distortions, although Vosburg concludes that his study, quote, "confirms the stereotype of the poor widow in Golden Age Spain," end quote. He offers a number of questions to be addressed by future research. Among his suspicions is the idea that some Spanish widows may have made themselves appear poorer than they actually were to avoid being placed on the tax rolls. And Mary Wiesner reports that in England, widows often stressed their poverty in successful appeals to the city and guild representatives. The term poor widow is certainly not unknown in English. Footnote 14. Vosburg, quote, "Status of widows," end quote, 192. Mary E. Wiesner, Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1993. 104. Still, the two opposing constructs of these stereotypes point to important differences in the way the two cultures understood the widow. There is at the moment a far greater body of research into the lives of women in early modern England than to the lives of their Spanish counterparts during the same period, and much more needs to be done. But early exploration suggests, perhaps a surprising conclusion, that widows in Catholic Spain enjoyed more freedom and respect than those in Protestant England. Primary and secondary sources in historical research. As you conduct research for your history paper, you will likely be working with one of two different types of information, primary sources and secondary sources. The difference between primary and secondary sources lies in the time they were created. Primary sources. Primary sources are materials that were created during the time period you are writing about. Common primary sources include newspapers and journals, maps, legal documents, business documents, speeches, letters, personal diaries, popular songs and ballads, oral histories, novels and poetry, and other types of books. When you're writing an essay based mainly on primary sources, your objective is typically to present your own interpretation of events based on your readings of sources from the time. Your essay should not just be a retelling of what happened, but should rather take up a position that you can defend using information drawn from your sources. When you rely on primary sources, it's important to use multiple sources and check your facts carefully. Essays based on primary sources are often organized chronologically. Secondary sources. Secondary sources are materials that were created after the time period you are writing about. These include, of course, books and articles written by historians. They may also include things like novels, poetry, songs, or operas written about the historical period. Secondary sources also include scholarly introductions to collections of primary materials. Secondary sources typically express a retrospective point of view and interpretation of the historical events they cover. When you are writing an essay based mainly on secondary sources, your task is to analyze the interpretations of other researchers and comment on their conclusions. You may agree or disagree with their positions, and you must provide evidence to support your position. Finally, you should be aware that any given source might be both a primary and a secondary source, depending on your historical point of view. For instance, Walter Pater's collection of essays, The Renaissance, 1873, would be considered a secondary source if you were writing about the art and poetry of 16th century Italy. However, if you were writing about the Victorian worldview, Pater's book would be considered a primary source.